longtime listeners of the show will know that even though my wife works in Hollywood, I, for the most part, don't want to meet Hollywood stars.
Right,
There is one, though, that has held my heart, literally.
Wait a minute. Are you saying
Paul
you've
Rudd?
Right. Paul Rudd is number one on the list. I know your list. I know your
Always
list.
wanted to meet Paul. A friend introduced me to him at the Avengers premiere. I made a jackass out of myself.
Yeah.
Couldn't talk. I did the humana. Yeah, I will meet him again. But anyway, but here's the long story short of all of this, Brad, is that I now have a new Hollywood person that I desperately want to meet.
A new crush.
A new crush, as it were. Yes. Brad, are you familiar with the show What We Do in the Shadows? Not the movie, the show.
I'm familiar with the movie. I have not seen the show yet because I really enjoyed the movie and I've heard good things about the show. And it's one of those things that I want to actually pay attention to instead of like listen to while I'm inking. So yes. It's on my list, but I haven't done it yet.
Well, first of all, I say this as a friend. There is probably no show that I could recommend with a stronger recommendation for Brad Geiger right now than What We Do in the Shadows.
Wow. You
got to give it like 3 or 4 episodes because it's got, like most things, it's got to warm up a little bit and you'll get the tone that it's going for. But it is chef's kiss so good, right? It's wonderful. Anyway, there is a vampire, or as Brad likes to call it, a Dracula on the show.
Yeah.
Named, the actor's name is Kayvan Novak, and he is a Persian-British actor who, I am not kidding when I say, might be the funniest person alive. He is
really
brilliant in his comic timing. He has created a character, Brad, that is so unique in the way he delivers his lines that I am in awe. Literally, my wife and I every week are in awe watching this guy work. And I specifically love him. I think he's amazing.
Wow.
And to the point where now, because I've always said to my wife, there's just a few actors I want my wife to cast in something of hers just so that we get a chance to meet him.
Yeah.
And one of them now is Kayvan Novak. I think he is brilliant. I think he is so funny.
Wow.
My third favorite actor is probably, and again, I'm always angling for my wife to cast him in something, is Paul F. Tompkins, who I think is comedically. He is one of the great stars of our age that has been given great roles and has had great shows and podcasts. Yeah. But I really feel like if given the right vehicle, he could be the most amazing comedic actor you've ever seen.
He was the voice of Mr. Peanut Butter in
he's Mr. Peanut Butter. He's played 1,000 voiceover parts. He's got a really distinct comedic timing and voice. Anyway, so if I had to rank him, God, I don't know. Kayvan Novak might take the lead right now. I just find him delightful.
Really?
And what's great is you watch him on the show, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to check out an interview with him, and I'll probably hear the same voice. Brad, he sounds completely different in real life than he does on the show.
I love actors like that.
He has developed this kind of voice for the show because he's a vampire, or as you like to call him, a Dracula. He's developed this voice for the show that's a mix of Persian and I guess Transylvanian. Like you don't really know what he's doing, but it's so good. And then you hear him and he's just got this standard RP British English accent in an interview and is delightful and clean shaven. And on the show he's got this long hair and a fairly full beard, right?
Big beard, yeah. I was looking at him on IMDb.
And then you see him in daily life in Britain, in London, and he's well shaved and got this RP English accent.
Yeah.
And so as a comedic actor, I just think he is amazing. And I cannot recommend the show enough to you, Brad, What We Do in the Shadows on Hulu.
It's on Hulu. Okay, so then I've got a deal for you. I will watch sometime this week What We Do in the Shadows. My kids have turned me into an anime fan, and it's largely thanks to Hulu.
Okay.
We got through My Hero Academia, which is delightful. But we're on one right now called Assassination Classroom. All right. And I'm going to show you a little animated GIF of the main, I guess he would be an antagonist at this point. This is him.
Now, am I looking at an octopus? What is that?
He's an alien. You can't, unfortunately, that didn't focus, but he's got a big spheroid head. It's yellow with what you would call a traditional happy face on it. And he's got tentacles. And he's dressed up like he's going to a graduation ceremony. He's got the graduation robes and he's got that 4-pointed hat, that they wear for graduates. Here's the story. He's an alien that shows up. First thing he does is blow up 75% of the moon. Lands on Earth and says,
as one does.
As one does when one is a happy-faced tentacle alien. He lands on the Earth and he says, I'm going to destroy Earth in 12 months unless you can kill me. And I'm going to teach this classroom of remedial students. And the entire time, I'm going to teach them, but their job is going to be to assassinate me using this special material that's harmful only to him, but not to humans. So they get to shoot guns, but if one of them gets shot with the bullet, it doesn't hurt them.
So it's a faux kryptonite, but it also doesn't hurt humans in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Okay.
Now, he's got a classroom full of students that he has to teach, and they are constantly trying to kill him. That is the concept. Now, first of all, when have you seen a concept like that on any American series?
Well, okay, so I have not seen anything like that on any American series, but it's funny because there is another Japanese series, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, called Danganronpa. Have you heard about this one?
That I haven't heard of, no.
It's basically a bunch of students locked into some mysterious high school, and the only way to escape is to be the last one surviving, having assassinated all your classmates.
Ooh, that's good too.
And so, like, you know how you can kind of there was a Star Wars series of novels where there was an admiral, I'm forgetting his name, but he can figure out his enemies based on the art they produce, you know?
Mm-hmm.
The Star Wars fans are going to go nuts right now that I can't remember his name. Anyway, it's a brilliant created character because he studies an alien culture's art to figure out who they are as a people and therefore can figure out how to conquer them militarily.
Oh, wow.
Which is a fun idea. But to me, it makes me wonder what the heck is going on with Japan that there's all these series where high schoolers have to murder one another or murder something. Like, is that just the... I mean, I know that that's also the American slasher movie is, hey, teens, don't have sex because then the slasher comes and gets you, that kind of thing.
Right.
So every teenage, it's all about pent-up emotion, and I get that. So, but it's funny to me that within seconds I thought of another Japanese property that also is about high schoolers killing one another or killing somebody or...
I'm telling you, watch the first few episodes of this. I am entranced by it. Absolutely entranced. It's a really, really well done story. And what's happening is you're starting to imprint and appreciate and love the alien because he's a really good teacher, and he really cares about these remedial students. And I keep bringing it up. Once you're in E class, you're a castaway. There's no hope for you. You're never getting out. You're going to be a ditch digger. And he's taking these kids on field trip. It's a little bit of, welcome back, Cotter,
right.
Taking them on field trips and everything. And he's getting really great results. They're doing great on their tests. But of course, their tests get thrown away. Who cares? They're just E class. He's a really good teacher. They're starting to love him as a teacher. But unless they kill him, the entire planet explodes. It's fantastic.
That is a funny concept.
Yeah.
That is a funny concept. And listen, because the other people who, like me, did not date in high school will be mad that I didn't know it. I just remembered that the Star Wars character's name is Grand Admiral Thrawn. And it's one of the greater characters ever created. The idea that he studies art, okay, so Assassination High School, your recommendation for me, my recommendation for you, What We Do in the Shadows. And then for everybody who, like me, did not date in high school, Grand Admiral Thrawn, great read.
Yeah, and then we'll meet back here next week and discuss.
That's right. That's our book club assignment for this week.
Yeah, I like this.
So on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about making comics.
And making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his friend who knows every name in Star Wars, except for apparently the one I was trying to recall. Cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of Stripped.
And this week's hour of comics advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. We've got a lot of topics this week that are not all, but mainly art focused. So I'm particularly excited about this show.
Yeah.
Because we try to mix in, as people know, a little bit of life advice, a little bit of business advice, a little bit of art advice. But this week, and I don't think I'm giving this away, but I always like to talk about the art topics. Those are my favorite ones. So stay tuned for a really fun art show. But first, I want to mention that our sponsor for this week is, of course, the good folks over at Wacom at wacom.com, the makers of the Wacom One. And boy, howdy, has that thing come in handy for us in the studio here, as it's now been transported over to Sheldon and Drive colorist Beth's location so that she can continue to color. And boy, howdy, has that saved our bacon. So a huge shout out, Brad, to the Wacom folks.
But listen, don't take our word for it. Listen to Angela, who's over at Twitter. Angela, I don't know whether I've got Angela's.
Who's over at Twitter?
Well,
you make it sound.
I don't. You know what? I don't have Angela's permission to use their full name, so I'm just going to say Angela. But she's a ComicLab listener, and she bought a Wacom One on our advice. She's been posting work from it. Oh my gosh, she's taken to it like a fish to water. It's amazing the work that's coming out of Angela. And from what I'm reading of Angela's tweets, Angela is loving it. So don't take our word for it. Take the word of a few ComicLab listeners. This is a really, really good tool.
That's fantastic. So we thank the folks at Wacom at wacom.com for making the sponsorship of the show happen.
Yeah.
And now, Brad, let's jump into the first question of the week. Comes in from Steve Galloway. And Steve writes, "Hi, Brad and Dave. Firstly, a huge thank you for all you do. ComicLab is a major factor in me pushing to realize a dream at nearly 40 to have my own webcomic. And your endless advice, knowledge, and banter is super helpful and greatly appreciated. My favorite words to hear each week, Dave, let's talk comics." That's fantastic. But also, I never get to say that, so that's fun that I got to say it this week. My question is, in the recycling or upcycling, well, no, that's a word I'm not familiar with. What is upcycling, Brad?
Yeah.
No, I'm genuinely asking you a question. What does that mean? I don't know what that means.
Upcycling, that's, I'm not even going to pretend. I've heard it. I'm not sure I understand it.
Okay, you can look that up while I read the question,
Okay.
My question is in the recycling or upcycling of jokes or interactions heard from other sources. I recently read one of my fave webcomics that, like my own, is based on being a parent, that presented an interaction read on Twitter in their own style as the comic. The author credited the tweet and its original author. I myself have heard stories secondhand or read tweets, etc., that I think would make a funny comic. And although I would credit sources, of course, working in academia, it's ingrained, but there's something that feels a little off from a creative point of view. I should have prefaced this by saying I'm a photographer by trade, and as such, copying and producing similar or recycled work is usually a big no-no, as is generally understood. Yeah, I would say in photo work. But what are your guys' thoughts? Can or should a webcomic creator interpret material from other sources, or should they always strive to be original? Many thanks again for helping me pursue a life's dream and making sure I'm always loaded for bear. Loved for bear is a very different.
That's a completely different
I've got
show.
a couple friends that are loved for bear. Yeah.
Upcycling, Dave, is when you take something and recycle it, but end up with something that's a higher or greater value.
Huh.
Upcycling.
So you take it. Okay. Now I would consider that to be something different than a form of recycling.
Yeah, recycling, you don't necessarily end up with something that's a higher value.
Right.
You take some scraps and make napkins out of it. Upcycling is when you take something and end up with a higher value.
When I start this show, Brad, versus when I end the show, you have upcycled me because I'm at a 4 before I start the show, but after an hour of laughing with Brad Geiger, I'm at a 10.
Here I am, upcycling again.
Brad, you're upcycling. Doctor, I've got a real problem with this upcycling. Oh, God.
So listen, let's talk about reusing jokes. I don't know where you come from on this. When I first started out, I had a really, really hard line attitude on this, that if it didn't come out of my head, I wasn't going to put it on paper. And it really bothered me because I would, there's so many, like we talked about on this show before, I know so many jokes, right? Jokes that I've heard, jokes that I've read places. And I'm the kind of guy like you, people would get me joke books and so forth. And I thought it would be really, really easy to just draw these jokes that I know. And later on, I would watch on the web as this whole idea of a dad joke came up. And really a dad joke is just kind of like a joke book joke that they make really sure is super clean and everything and focuses a lot on wordplay. And when I watched all these dad jokes becoming very popular, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally missed that. I could have been doing that from the beginning, but in a lot of ways, it would have meant using kind of this material that I didn't come up with. And I really wanted to challenge, not challenge. It so happens that I came from a similar background as our question asker. I came from a journalism background, and this idea of using something that wasn't mine was really distasteful to me. And even now when I see it, I see people using what are clearly joke book jokes, right? Or jokes that, we've all heard, or jokes that they've seen written, Reader's Digest jokes and stuff like this. And a lot of times they try to pass it off. Like they'll say, hey, it's Dumb Joke Tuesday. And they'll do this joke, and it's clearly something that they haven't written. And they're kind of passing it off. They're trying to kind of come up with this idea of, well, don't count this as like an official thing that I do, but here's this thing that I'm doing it anyway. Right. I never liked that for me. And how did you feel about this when you first started out writing?
Well, I think it's more helpful to talk about it now versus when I started out. I, like you originally, come down pretty hard against using something that has not come from my head, or at the very least come from a situation that I was a part of, and I was a participant in the joking moment. You know what I mean? But never something third hand, and never something from a source that I don't know or that I just read, because for me, I don't know how to say it other than I would rather not produce a comic than to produce a comic with something that's not mine.
Yeah.
And I've told this story before, but it's worth sharing when we slip up, because we all slip up, and it's worth just admitting when it happens. Many years ago, probably 18 years ago, and for what I can only describe as an accident of memory, I thought that an idea had come from my own mind. That, how some ideas are bubbling around in your mind for a while, and then you're like, all right, I'm going to write that one down. I thought that I genuinely thought that this idea had come from my own mind, right? And I wrote up a storyline, and I was probably 3 or 4 strips in on the storyline, and I got an email from Rich Stevens of Diesel Sweeties, the great Diesel Sweeties, and Rich is like, hey, in friendship, I did this exact same joke in this exact same storyline, different characters, different format, but 3 years ago or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And holy shit, Brad, he was right. I think what had happened was I had read it.
Yeah.
It had percolated way to the back of my mind, and percolated is the right word, because I had then forgot the source of the idea. It had been repercolating and maybe upcycling, if you want to put it that way, in my head. And here, 3 years later, I'm like, well, I'm finally going to use that idea that I've had bouncing around in my head. Well, the idea was Rich's. That's why it got there in the first place, right?
Yeah.
I, of course, admitted to Rich, God, I'm so embarrassed, and I was genuinely embarrassed. So much that I'm still embarrassed 18 years later that it happened,
But that's a different thing, right? That's a different thing. That's a not planned thing. You didn't plan to do that, right?
Right. But what I'm getting at, though, is in sharing that moment is, it's kind of a once bitten, twice shy thing.
Yeah.
Now, if I am not, if I personally am not 100% sure that the idea came from me, I don't use it. Or I really second guess it. If I'm like, wait, was that an idea from me, or did I read that somewhere? By the way, there's probably 100 jokes over the course of Sheldon that I've never written, because I wasn't 100% sure if I had read it on something, or seen it on a show, or, read it in a Douglas Adams book or something. So I didn't use it, right? And that's my attitude, is I do not want to use anything that's not mine, is ultimately because what if I wanted just to be an illustrator? That's a career path, right? Other people give me ideas, and then I illustrate them. That's fine. I don't want to be an illustrator of other people's ideas. I want to create my own ideas, write them, and then draw them, right?
Yep. And that's, I guess, why I started at the beginning in terms of when I first started out, because I held my feet to the fire on that, because I kind of had that hard nose, I'm not going to use this unless I know that it came out of my head. And I've had those same moments when I realized that I subconsciously cribbed something. Or how many times have I sent you a little sketch? I know I've done it at least once or twice, where I say, have you ever seen this someplace else? Like, have you seen this punchline? Because sometimes you write a punchline and you're like, oh, somebody else must have done this.
And anytime you send me one of those sketches, I'm always like, Brad, stop sending me sketches of your junk. I don't want this. It is funny, but I don't want this.
Yeah, those all go in the handbook. But I'm just going to laugh at my own joke. But yeah, I've been there. But so here's the deal: having done this now and walked that path for a long, long time, year after year, a lot of which was writing jokes that, frankly, if you go back and read them, weren't very good, didn't work for a different number of reasons. I struggled with a lot, spent a lot of time writing stuff, and struggled with getting to that punchline.
Right.
Now, years later, I can write a joke. I can write a joke pretty well. I'm getting better. I'm not. I always say I'm not as good as I'm going to be in a few years, but I'm confident in my ability to write now. And if I had been using those shortcuts, if I had been allowing myself to do joke book jokes, the problem with that is number one, you never really learn how to solve these problems on your own. The other thing is eventually you get to the end of the joke, or you get to the end of the joke book, right? You're only as good as the material that you're cribbing from someone.
That's another great way to look at it. Yeah. You can only steal so much.
Yeah. At some point you get to the last page of the book, and now what are you going to do? You haven't learned how to write a joke for yourself. You haven't gone in there and fought that battle. And now, you've got nothing to show for, you've got nothing to show for the experience you had.
Right. Now, I want to be more even-handed because I came out pretty strong about using other ideas. But I do think there is a place in art for recontextualizing, which is different than using written material, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, visually, you can think of like a David Malky Wondermark cartoon as a brilliant recontextualization of early printed images, not early, but early 19th century, late 18th century printed images. Mm-hmm. Not 18th century. What am I saying? Late 19th, earliest 20th century printed images. Sorry, Dave. That are recontextualized in a modern or semi-modern format that are brilliant, right? And so those visuals, the same could be true for a written context in the sense that, like, Sarah Cooper takes Trump's spoken audio, recontextualizes it to her own comedy bits, right? She's brilliant at that. What I'm saying is there is a place in art and in comedy and in writing for recontextualizing things, but that's different than using a straight up idea, I think, right, Brad? Isn't that a fair differentiation?
It's completely different. Now, every now and again, you will see somebody who, and I think there's different ways and different levels of success, but they'll take like somebody else's tweet, or they'll take something and make a cartoon out of it, but it's clearly someone else's tweet. For me personally, for my personal aesthetic, that falls under the same category. However, if you are going to do something like that, where you're taking somebody's tweet or you're taking something out of some other source, what the question asker mentions at the very beginning is I think, valid. If you're going to take something from a source, credit that source. Be upfront about it. I'm taking, this punchline, or, this thing is written, this came from a tweet, and point back to the tweet. Because as cartoonists, we don't like to see somebody use our work without attribution. Even if it's just a tweet, it's somebody's mental work. It's their IP in the strictest sense of the word. So you should be pointing back to that person's Twitter if you got it off of their Twitter feed, or pointing back to whatever the source is. You should be doing attribution sourcing if you are going to use somebody else's material. But at the same time, remember, this is a cheat. This is not writing. And you are not learning to write when you're doing this. And it doesn't mean that you're never going to become good at this type of writing. But I will tell you, it's probably going to take you longer because you're not using that muscle.
And for those of you that have listened to our Writer's Room episodes on ProTips, which is the for folks that are patrons at patreon.com/ComicLab, we do a second show every week. And anyway, what I would suggest is, if you want to go down this route of jumping off someone else's joke or someone else's idea, then do what Brad and I do in Writer's Room, and that's the prompt which then you eventually get 30 steps away from, and then the material is quite truly your own, right?
Right. Yeah.
Don't take that as the finality of what could be written. Take it as the first step on a journey of 1,000 miles of what could be written, you know?
Yeah. And then push that concept. Make that concept go to a new place. Remember, just like I tell my writing students every semester, and I'll be doing it Monday, I'll be giving them this very lecture on Monday. Ideas are bullshit, right? It's what you do with the idea that counts.
It's execution. Yes.
It's execution. It's the work that you put into it. So if you come upon something that you think is a really, really good idea, you're probably right. It's probably a great idea. But that doesn't mean it's the only idea. It doesn't mean that it's not an idea you can push even further.
Right. I will say one last thing, and then maybe we'll move on. But one last thing is, even if you don't run into legal issues, and boy, I'm not guaranteeing you won't run into legal issues for stealing someone else's idea, I will say that in the creative community, stealing a joke or stealing an idea intentionally, boy, nothing makes you more of a persona non grata in a creative community quicker than stealing a joke or stealing an idea. You become the 9gag of cartoonists if you do, you know? And by the reason there, I'm saying 9gag just steals material and republishes it. But you know what I mean? Yeah. So what I'm saying is you gain very few friends among other creatives if you steal ideas or steal jokes, or even winkingly like lift a joke, you know, or lift an idea.
Well, yeah.
It's just not something you want to do. To Brad's point, work that muscle, get better at doing it yourself. And I think the benefits 5, 10, 15 years on will be so much more joy, in the same way of like being able to play a guitar 15 years on. And like, what a joy that you took that journey than just listen to music, you know, that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, Brad, so let's change it up here and talk about something that frankly neither one of us wants to talk about.
Yeah, no kidding.
So we I don't remember, a week, 2, 3 weeks back, we talked about plagiarism actually, and now plagiarism has come up as a huge topic in the art world.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's hard to avoid.
Hard to miss it.
Yeah, no matter which social media you're on, unless you've been living under a rock, then you already know parts of what we're going to tell you. First of all, let's start here. There's a guy by the name of Alphonso Dunn. He's an artist and an arts educator. And he wrote a book called Pen and Ink Drawing, A Simple Guide. And he recently posted a YouTube video claiming that Jake Parker plagiarized his 2015 book. Jake's book that's coming out pretty soon, it's called Inktober All Year Round, is scheduled to ship on September 15th.
Well, not ship, scheduled to release.
No, yeah, you're right. Scheduled to release September 15th, according to its publisher, which is Chronicle Books.
Right, yes, Chronicle Books. And so Alfonso's video, it's about an hour long and uses a 30-second flip-through posted on Jake's Instagram account. You know, and by flip-through, I mean, you know those kinks when someone's got a book coming out, and they have the camera angle.
Thumbs around the edge of the cord and kind of flips all. You see all the pages, or you see a bunch of the pages.
Right, and so as you can imagine with any video of good quality, you can take stills and freeze frame and all that sort of stuff, right? And so it uses that as well as pages from the book that have been posted by Chronicle or Jake to promote the release. And so Brad and I have watched the full hour video, as have many other people, and it's compelling.
It's that's probably the best word for it. It's compelling. The video points out similarities between the two books. And there's similarities, frankly, that are more than a little uncomfortable.
Yeah,
it's not that both books discuss drawing texture or line quality,
right? Because that's been, you know, from the Renaissance on, as you know, a standard in teaching.
Everyone, and everybody does the same things. They put little cross hatching inside little boxes or little circles. There's only so many different ways you can promote that. But I don't think that's Alfonso's point. When you watch the video, the crux of the accusation that Mr. Dunn is making is that both books discuss the topic in very similar ways, using very similar examples, and sometimes with very similar words and presentations, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's as I was saying, only using still frames from a flip through video. So there's a genuine interest on everyone's part to see what the two, technique chapters are going to look like when they're placed physically side by side in high res.
Oh yeah.
And Brad, another thing that we haven't talked about in this context is Alphonso Dunn is African American, and that adds a whole nother layer of meaning to the situation due to the long history of Black creators seeing their work appropriated.
Yeah. And just as a creator in general, right? If I think to a certain part, you put something out in the world, and if I felt like I was plagiarized, I don't know that I would have reacted as calmly or pragmatically or respectfully as this video. It would have been me with steam coming out of my ears and flipping tables, and screaming and this video did a very, very a very nice job of just lining up. Here's some things that are, I guess the phrase, Dave, that keeps coming to my mind is too close for comfort, right?
Yeah, it's the
it's just too close for comfort.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So this went on for a good 24 hours on social media, and then Jake responded in plain and we have to. By the way, let's not. Jake has been a guest on our show, right? We can't pretend that that's not the case. Jake, who has been a ComicLab guest. He responded in a plain text post on Twitter and Instagram, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's important for this conversation, so I'll paraphrase. And I think he makes about 5 points here. He asserts that he did not plagiarize anyone. He says, quote, "The artist," unquote, "made this a public issue instead of contacting Parker directly, and he welcomes him to reach out independently." Let's see. He says that the publisher, Chronicle Books, is aware of the matter and is involved in addressing the issue. He says that he can't say more due to legal aspects, but he has more to say. And he ended by noting his excitement for the upcoming Inktober challenge.
Right. Yeah. And so, because October is a mere days away.
Yeah.
So anyway, as of now, the comments and the reactions seem to come down pretty heavily on Alfonso's read.
Mm-hmm.
But Jake certainly has gotten a wave of support after he posted and in subsequent postings and that sort of thing. So it's worth asking, where does that leave us? So as of right now, the book itself, very interestingly, has been placed on hold by the publisher and has disappeared, as far as I can tell, Brad, from the Amazon website and definitely from Chronicle Books' website.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Sometimes Amazon is regionally dependent, so I don't know if it's worldwide.
Yeah, well, I looked it up just to check, and it doesn't come up for me. But I don't know what that means.
Right.
But just
and that could be as easy as a button push and it's back up again. That kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
So DeviantArt, the website, has canceled their first ever Inktober challenge, which was going to be kind of a art contest based around Inktober. And Lightbox Expo, which is a art exposition in part run by Jim DeMonakis in Pasadena, has canceled their involvement with Inktober. But on the flip side, the Inktober prompts are still happening. They're still coming out. And Inktober itself is still proceeding.
You'll see those hashtags, I'm sure, around social media.
Right.
So, God. So here's the deal. We've got a bajillion thoughts on the matter.
Yeah,
right?
no, yeah. And listen, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of copyright law. And I mean, that could be weeks long.
Yeah, we could do. And listen, if we're wrong about this, you'll see Dave and I firing up the mics. We'll be the first ones to fire up the mics and say so. But here's the short of it. For me, is what it comes down to is that number one, we're brokenhearted about what we've seen so far. It's the only fair way to say it is that we're surprised by Jake's reaction to Alfonso's video, right? And we'll be following the situation closely to see how it turns out.
Yeah.
So listen, Dave, that brings us to a question I've got here from Patreon backer Richard Joy, who says, "Hi, Brad and Dave. My question is about deciding what your highest tier on Patreon should be. I'm backing a few creators at their highest tier, and for at least a couple of those, I would be willing to bump up further if there was a higher tier, naturally with some sort of reward attached. I'm not claiming to be a saint here. It makes me wonder how you decided what your top tier would be. Aside from not being able to think of a suitable reward, why wouldn't an artist want to have at least one tier that was just too expensive? Seems like you're leaving money on the table if your top tier has any takers. There may be some people in that tier who would upgrade even given the incentive to do so." So, Dave, the question is this. Where do you, we all know, we've said on the show a million times, $2 should be your lowest Patreon tier. But what about your top tier, and how do you decide what that top tier is?
Well, this is a great question, and it's a great opportunity for me, Brad, unknown to you, to announce our new ComicLab Patreon tier over at patreon.com/ComicLab. For $100 a month. Brad will draw a wonderful caricature of you, and then he and I will split the money. So, Richard, you'll want to jump in on that. Brad's going to do caricatures for everyone at the $100 level, and then he and I will split the money. So that's a new level over at patreon.com/ComicLab. Get in quick, because I'm going to set the limit at 100 people. So we're going to...
you're going to limit it to just 100, huh?
Just 100. So you're going to want to jump right in on that, because Brad's got to get to work.
There's nothing I hate more than a caricature. Oh, man. Oh, man.
I know it.
Man, you know me too well.
Listen, I
you
was
know
being a pal on many levels there.
Yeah, you know how to make me squirm. So here's the deal. This is everybody's worst nightmare, thinking that they've got a Patreon backer out there who would give them more money if only they would have the tier for it. What advice do we have to give these folks?
So I will. Let me talk to you about what I do, and then let me talk to you about what the guilty self-hating artist in me fights against, right? So number one is on Sheldon, I have two levels. One is if you back at I don't remember what the number is offhand, but if you back at a certain level, by the end of the year, you can claim the entire Sheldon book collection, and I'll send you books 1 through 8 of Sheldon, mail that off to you, and bada bing, bada boom. It's basically, the way I look at it, an installment plan towards buying the books, right? It's like the old Sears layaway plan, where like, the missus and I are going to get a couch, and we're going to buy it on layaway, that kind of thing. But apparently that was Mickey Mouse buying that couch. I don't know what that was. Anyway, so I think of that as a layaway plan. And then I also have a level where you can, I think it's at $10 a month or something, maybe $15 a month. You can, by the end of the year, claim a Sheldon original from the archives. And that's a pretty good deal, because normally I think those go for $150 on the site or $160, something like that. And so you get a significant discount, and you're doing monthly on Patreon, right? And then for Drive, I have a really expensive one that I think is kind of fun, in that whenever I have a human in the background of Drive, you could potentially be drawn into Drive.
Oh, that's
This is a
nice.
background character, right? It's it's a tiny walk-on, which I've never done before, but I actually thought for Drive, what the hell, why not? That'd be fun. So that's what I do. Now, the question, I guess, could be asked, even with those levels in place, why don't I have an even higher level, right? And I guess there reaches a point where you're like, that's good enough. For me anyway. Yeah. Like, the guilty self-hating artist is like, I don't want to go higher than that. Like, what else could I offer? Like, your own personal back rub. Like, I don't know what could I do beyond art, beyond books, beyond a caricature? There's not much more,
Yeah, and not only that, but my own personal feelings on Patreon is if you want a monthly pledge, you should offer a monthly reward, right? And a lot of what you're saying, and that being said, one of my upper level tiers, you get like every 3 months and stuff like that. So at some point with those, you're taking on a certain amount of extra work, red tape, because now, let's say Barry joins at that one where at the end of a year, Barry gets a bunch of books, right? You've got to track
for the purposes of the story. Can we make Barry Gibb? I would love it if Barry Gibb signed up.
Yes, exactly. One of the brothers G comes in and he says, okay, I want to do this. Now you got to keep track that Barry Gibb came in on June. You got to check in June after that. And Barry doesn't come in saying, I'm going to be this guy, right?
Right.
You don't know he's going to stick around. But if he does, that's a lot of extra work for you.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's where we really got to come out on this is that, yes, we all are terrified to think that there's a patron out there that would give us more money if they could. The other side of that is this. At some point, when you're offering higher and higher tiers, the flip side of that coin is you've got to offer something at those higher tiers that makes those higher dollar values worth it. And a lot of times to do that, you're going to get into so much extra work that it actually isn't worth it. In other words, if I've got a Patreon backer out there who wants to give me more money, fantastic. I've got a Kickstarter coming right up with that person's name on it, right? I've got lots of places for that person to contribute money if they want to. I still think what you've got to do with Patreon is take the ladder into effect of walking your reader and yourself up the ladder. Here's what I'm willing to do for $2 a month. Here's what I can do for $5 a month. Here's what I can do for $10 a month, right? And what you're doing with your reader is you walk them up the ladder and you basically get them in saying, oh yeah, I would do $2 a month. And you go, well, for $5, you could have this. And they go, oh, yeah, for $5, I could have that. That's great. I'll do $5. And you go, well, for $10, you could have this. And you walk them up the ladder until
This is Brad Geiger, carpet salesman, is what it is.
Yes, very much so. And you get to a point where you say, for $20, you could have this. And they say, oh, well, no, it's not. That's good. I'm good at 10.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you want to have happen. But along the way, as you're saying, you could have this, you could have this, what you're saying to you is, okay, for 10, I'm going to have to do this, right? And if it's something that is exclusive art or exclusive work that they have access to, I'm a big fan of. If you start going down the road of I'm going to start sending postcards out or I'm going to start doing sketches, all of that labor-intensive stuff that doesn't have a big back end. In other words, I do a ton of exclusive comics. But that has a big back end. That's a big driver of Patreon. And I put that into books. I get lots out of that.
Right.
That's why you don't see me sending out postcards, right? Huge labor intensive operation. And there's no back end, right?
Right. So I'm going to jump in on this because, I super agree with Brad, but I want to give you two examples from where this is problematic. One, I will say, and I think Brad will admit to this too, our higher levels, boy, are our bread and butter for our annual income, right? They are, bread and butter is not the right word. They are our big earners for our annual income. Like they make a big difference. So yes, both Brad and I would say do have higher levels. Don't just stay at the $1, $2, $3 level. Make something special, right?
Right.
So I'm going to say a couple things though. One is, boy, do I concur with Brad about the trickiness of the Patreon's inability to track these rewards that come once a year or every once to 2 years or whatever it is. And I'll tell you an example because it happened just last week. I got an email, Brad, from someone that said, hi, I've been backing Sheldon at the X level, and I am now owed 4 original arts for 4 years of backing at that level.
Yeah.
They were super friendly. I was super friendly. Neither one of us had a way of tracking it. And so it just had gone by for 4 years. And he's like, I'd like 4 original arts, please. And I was like, happy to give it to him. But neither he nor I had a way of easily tracking it, right? So just be aware of that's a problem. The second one is, boy, am I going to co-sign Brad's statement that you want, if you're giving yourself extra work with these higher reward tiers, make sure that you can use the result of it in multiple channels. Because when I do a character insertion into Drive, it's mostly a headache. I have to find the person. I have to ask them for couple different photos. Yeah. I also have that same problem again of like having to track them. Hey, did you earn this year yet? Oh, you're at 2 years. Does that mean you get 2? I don't know. Hold on. We'll figure this out. Like all of that gets confusing. And then I have to get the photos and then draw them in. Does it really help me in any other stretch? Not really.
No.
But it did bring in more income. But to Brad's point, The one thing that I have done well is once, maybe twice a year, I will open up my commissions, and I will do it with planning. What I mean by that is I open up my schedule to know that I've got commissions coming up so I don't take on any other work. The problem with when those drive character inserts happen is you can't predict it. I could be in the middle of something really busy, need to crank out a drive page, and someone's like, hey, wink, wink, you owe me a human character being me in the strip. And I'm like, oh, God. All right. And then it slows the whole process down. I can't prepare for it. But with my commission list, like Brad, if it's for Drive and someone asks for a really great commission, once it's done, once they mail it out, I usually say, hey, do you mind if I get to share it with the Patreon folks? And do you mind if I put it at the back of a Drive book? And usually because their fans are like, are you kidding? I would love for this original art that I own to be in the back of the Drive book.
Yeah.
And if not, that's fine too. They commissioned it. But usually, I would say 90% of the time, people are like, yeah, but by all means, share it. It looks great. And by doing so, I get an extra page out of a book. I get an extra Patreon post. And I know saying I get an extra page out of the book doesn't sound like much, but when you're holding a 250-page book, those extra 10 or 15 pages in the back, they add a little bit of extra value. They do.
Yeah.
So I will co-sign Brad, and I think we can put that one on a button. That yes, higher levels, but just make sure you're not giving yourself extra work. And also be aware that Patreon doesn't really offer you any trackable ability of like when people are owed these weird, unique levels. So it's going to be a little bit of a headache to keep track of it for you and for the readers. So
keep in mind, scalability is going to be the key word here. In other words, at those higher levels, if you're going to do that, make sure that it scales. Your worst case scenario is that you're successful. And a whole bunch of people, and then a whole bunch of people jump in, and you can't do this month after month, or you can't keep up with it. So think about scalability. Here's the deal. You should not be doing a high-level tier just to have one because that you think that this question asker might be one of your readers, right? Remember what I said in the middle of this topic. If you've got somebody who wants to give you extra money, there's lots of ways for them to do that. You don't necessarily need to create a Patreon tier that's going to be a headache to make that happen.
And I will offer something else, a different way of looking at this, which is sometimes I let the market decide how much they would like to give me. And the way I do that is with eBay. I will draw a piece that I think is lovely. I was happy with it. I might even use it for backup material in a book. But I started at a penny, and I just let eBay decide if someone wants to pay $200 for it, great. If someone wants to pay $550 for it, great. And then the piece goes out based on what the market was willing to pay me, which is a version of what you're saying is people want to give you more money. Well, let them do it on eBay. And in so doing, they're competing against the 4 other people that really want to give you more money, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics.
So, Dave, I'm just looking at the calendar, and if I've got this right, this is the last day to jump in on your really exciting Kickstarter for the 2 new Sheldon books at newsheldonbook.com.
That's right, Brad. Newsheldonbook.com. 2 books that, because we met the stretch goal, it's now 432 pages of Sheldon comics.
Holy
at
cats.
one low price. And
How
this
many
is
pounds? I figure you got this figured out. How many pounds of Sheldon is that?
It's going to be like 3 or 4 pounds of Sheldon.
Oh, that's a lot. Pound for pound, one of the best comics on the internet.
Although I got to tell you, you describing my comics as in poundage is not the way I want to talk about.
Listen, there's a lot of comics out there. You read them and it's like, nah, this is not a good heft. When I read a Sheldon, that's a good heft for a comic there.
Can we get off the heft? I want to get off this boat. I don't like this.
All right, you say what you want to say about your Kickstarter.
Well, what I was going to say is thank you to all the ComicLab listeners that are especially. I've had notes from folks that are new to Sheldon. Like they've listened to the podcast, they've loved it. And if you like my humor, if you appreciate my angle on jokes and stuff, you will love Sheldon. And I really appreciate those of you who have emailed saying, hey, because of the podcast, I jumped in over at newsheldonbook.com. That actually means the world to me because I've been doing Sheldon for 20 years. So anytime there's someone new, it still warms my heart, Brad, that people are still jumping in and trying it. And so thank you for that.
And honestly, really, I say this without reservation. One of the best people doing humor on the web right now. I wouldn't be doing this show with him week after week if I didn't think he was entertaining on some level, and it comes through on Sheldon all the time. So I'm personally a backer of this Kickstarter, and I'm super excited to get my books already. And all I had to do was go over to newsheldonbook.com.
Well, thank you, my friend. And thank you to everybody who's jumping in over at newsheldonbook.com. I really appreciate it. The books are looking fantastic. We already got the test proofs. Yeah. And I'm super excited about it. So thank you for jumping in. Last day over at newsheldonbook.com. And Bradley J. Geiger.
And a good 9 inches on the spine,
please,
right?
Oh my God, please. Please stop saying it in poundage, in inches. I don't like any of this. The Catholic school kid in me immediately gets hives as you start to describe it this way. I'm like, no, stop it. Don't talk about it this way. I don't want this.
We got a question to move to.
Yes, we do. This comes in from Alexi, who over at patreon.com/comiclab, who writes, you guys frequently talk about proper word balloon use and helpful techniques. How do you use word balloons of someone talking that is no longer in the scene? This is a great question.
Yeah.
Like in movies, they would do a voiceover of the character remembering something someone told them. But since you can't do voices, you do a square caption box and the person's name, colon, followed by what is said in quotations. For example, Brad, colon, no, Dave. Or would you I like that or would you draw the person in a thought bubble and the person is speaking? I feel like that's a bit convoluted. Is there a simpler way? Brad Geiger, This is a great question because it happens both for flashbacks. It happens for a scene change where someone is finishing their thought. I know you've done that frequently. Mm-hmm. It happens when there is a camera angle change where suddenly you couldn't fit all 15 people that are in that scene. And so Susan, who's off screen, is coming in from a voice bubble off the panel. Brad, what are your thoughts? How are your techniques for approaching this? What are the best practices?
Well, I've got a lot of, I actually have some very, very solid rules for myself that I apply to myself, and I'll share them with you to see if maybe there's something here that you can use for yourself. But first, the whole idea of using a narration box with somebody's name and then colon and then quote the stuff they said and then end quote. I had a visceral reaction when I read that
because it feels a little bit like accounting, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, not only that, but there's a real philosophical reason that I think that's not only wrong but deadly wrong. Right. Because this whole idea of a comic, we have certain lexiconography. We've got certain visuals.
Lexiconography. And that's been the show, everybody. Brad Geiger. This week's word of the day from Brad Geiger, lexiconography.
We've got certain things like, okay, we've got a word balloon that points at somebody and we say, and we understand that person is speaking. And we've got a narration box and we know that's the omniscient narrator. To go Brad colon quote blah blah blah, you're taking your reader right out of that spell that you're weaving with comics. And again, your whole job as a cartoonist is to put them under that spell. And once you pop them out of it, you may lose them because remember, all they got to do is flinch a finger and they're off to YouTube and they're gone. So I had a real visceral reaction to that, like, oh God, don't do that. Okay. But I've got a number of rules. Number one, and my number one rule is to avoid an off-panel speaker at all costs unless it's necessary.
Boy, do I co-sign that. Keep going. I super co-sign that.
So number one, this shouldn't be something that you're doing super often with certain caveats. Okay. Now, here's what I would do. If you've got somebody speaking off panel that hasn't been introduced yet, or right? They haven't been in a previous panel recently, and they're coming in, and this is often done for surprise, right? Two thieves are sitting there at the table, they're counting off the money, and then somebody from off panel says, "Look what I found." And then in the next panel, it's going to be revealed to be, a police officer. I would, when that happens, I do my standard word balloon, and I have the tail go right through the panel of the comic. Right?
Yes. Now describe for that.
The panel.
I would like you to get specific on that. Does the tail close, or do you have it cut through the panel so that there is no let's say the vertical line of the panel is broken, right?
Yes.
And then do you have the lines of the tail merge into the vertical, or do you have the tail cross over the vertical so that it floats above it?
The tail goes through the panel, but once it's past the panel, it disappears. So what happens
what I do as well.
Is there's a gap in the panel. There's nothing in the gutter. In other words, that balloon tail does not form a point in the gutter.
Okay, now I wanted to drill down on that. First of all, thank you for doing that, because for me, that's a really important distinction, because if the tail continues past the panel, the vertical panel line, what you're somewhat indicating is that whatever point it is pointing to in the next panel is where that voice is coming from. Now, that's a different kind of a mood that you're creating there, and you don't want that.
Yep.
You want it to say that if the conceit of a panel, Brad, forgive me for jumping on your point here, if the conceit of a panel is this square represents a point in time, right? And then if the voice bubble is piercing that line and crossing over into the next panel, you are saying that someone is intruding from the following panel into that one, and so it's a moment of interruption, which is fine, but that's different than the voice bubble tail disappearing into what is understood to be off screen, right?
Exactly. And I actually have it pierce the panel itself to reinforce that it's coming from somewhere outside of even that panel distinction.
The place and time of that moment. Yes, exactly.
Yes. So that's one thing that I do if I have to have somebody speaking from off panel that hasn't been in the panel before. Now, here's what I don't do. I don't allow myself to have a word balloon without a tail. And you see this in manga an awful lot. It's almost accepted in manga. For me, it's too much ambiguity for me to be comfortable with. If you have a word balloon floating there that doesn't point to anybody, okay? And I see it an awful lot. Too much ambiguity. I need to know where that's coming from. Now, the obvious rejoinder to that is, well, what happens if you have like a bodiless person speaking, like a ghost? Is speaking.
Or in my case, if it's like an on-ship comms that are understood to be from like some non-physical speaker, right?
At that point, it doesn't become dialogue. It becomes a sound effect for me. And I treat it like a sound effect. So I won't have any balloon at all, and I'll give it sound effect lettering, and I can use, the wavy kind of bass line or any number of things. I will give that a sound effect treatment much sooner than I'll do a word balloon without a tail.
Yeah, and I will, in a somewhat similar way, I will change my voice bubble word balloon from being a perfect oval to either having a tiny spurt of electrical energy on a corner or spectral energy if it's a ghost, or whatever the main means of communication was, just to indicate that this is a voice that's present in the room, but it's not coming from a person, but it's coming from a device or from the another world or another realm or whatever it is, that kind of thing.
Now, I have done the jaggy word balloon that we see an awful lot for electronic voices. But if I do that, and sometimes there is a temptation to do that without a tail, but then I always tell myself, well, wait a minute, that electric sound is coming from somewhere. It's coming from a speaker. It's coming from somebody's device. And I try to find a place to point a tail to, even if I've got to draw a speaker special for that scene. It's got to be coming from somewhere.
Right.
The one thing I really don't like in a comic is ambiguity, because again, you're weaving a spell, and you don't have the wherewithal to play with somebody's attention. If the minute they start asking questions like, wait a minute, where's that coming from? Unless that's a vital part of the story, it's a risk, in my opinion.
Now, let me ask you a question, because you use a technique that I respect, but I don't personally like or use. So I want to ask you about it, because I do respect your skill in storytelling. When you and Evil Inc. Switch scenes, you're like, oh no, but the criminals downtown are in the bank right now. And then it cuts to downtown and somebody finishes their saying, but we're going to go get them right now, right?
Right.
And I will see you use an ellipses, a dot, because it's a continuation of that same person speaking. And then usually you'll do it either in a narration box or a somewhat of a vocal box that's a little bit differentiated, and sometimes with quotes in it, right?
Yep. I've got
that's
like
not a technique that I love.
That.
I've seen you use it for either flashbacks, and I've seen you use it for scene changes. Again, I don't particularly like using it, but you do, and I would like to hear your thoughts about what you think is the benefits of that and why it works or doesn't work.
I've got, so this comes into a lot of my own personal aesthetic and my own personal philosophy of comics. But and I'll tell you why I did it first. I did it, and here's why I do that. It allows me to do that crash cut kind of comedic scene that in one moment it's two people talking, and then in that next scene I can completely change the scene and do the equivalent of what we would call in video a crash cut. Right. And I can get a lot of comic energy, a lot of humor out of that quick change. So I needed to find a way to facilitate that. And that's how I started developing this, which is basically a narration box. It does have to have quotes inside of it because, again, a word balloon, the word balloon itself stands in for quotation marks. You don't need quotation marks inside of a word balloon because it's assumed that that's what the person is saying.
Right.
Narration boxes are different. And so the way I visually indicate a difference between a narration box and one of these, word balloon continuation boxes is by A, I give them quotations, and B, I always draw the character's head inside that narration box speaking. So now it becomes this amalgam between a word balloon and a narration box, because and a panel, frankly, it really becomes a very small panel that you can see the person talking. There's no balloon, but there is words, and the quotation marks set that off as a continuation of the dialogue.
Right. And I want to say, again, that I respect Brad's storytelling, and even though I don't use it, it works within Brad's universe, right? So, because we know it's a subjective thing. It's different strokes for different folks, and he uses it well. And again, you do use it for that comic crash cut timing where you're getting a payoff even in the first panel. But can I go deeper on this? Because I actually think there's an interesting philosophical approach to this. By the way, I think Archie Comics used to use that too, with the floating head continuing. Like if Jughead was telling a story and then you're flashing back, Jughead would kind of be floating for a minute, continuing the story, right? And I'm just thinking back of another comic that used it well. Anyway, when you have a character whose disembodied voice crash cuts to another scene of which they are not even a part, right? What's interesting from a philosophical standpoint of how your storytelling works is you are basically telling the audience this character and their viewpoint is so important that it is carrying through even on scenes that they're not a part of, right?
Yeah.
And so I think one of the reasons why I don't use it for Drive, is my science fiction strip, is that there is no individual character who themselves is so important that their opinion or perspective or viewpoint needs to be imposed on a scene that they don't appear in. Do you know what I mean? Whereas for you, I think it's because, especially with superheroes, the individual is so important that their viewpoint can have value and weight even on a scene that they're not a part of. Does that make sense philosophically?
Right. Yeah, no, I would co-sign that because the whole reason I do it is I want you to hear that line in that character's voice.
Right.
And by establishing, the other part is, once I establish that, once somebody starts reading my comic and they see that happen a certain number of times, now I can use that to do some really kind of cool effects. In fact, I'm doing that on the comic I just posted today, where I do this to show a flashback. In other words, Captain Heroic is speaking in the present in the narration box, and then in the panel, it's Captain Heroic, but it was hours earlier. So he's in both places, but you can show that since he's in both places, this must be taking place at different times, and you can use that same crash cut to say, I'm going to tell you a story about what I did earlier this afternoon.
Right.
And it's something that I think is pretty powerful. And for me, I wasn't a big reader of Archie comics, but in superhero comics, when I was still reading those mainstream superhero comics, of course, and we've talked about this in the past, there was this big rebellion against thought balloons, and they replaced thought balloons with narration. And then that became the internal narration of the character, and they would always use the superhero's symbol next to the narration box. Like if Green Lantern were speaking, it would be the Green Lantern symbol next to his narration box, and then if Batman were thinking, it would be the Bat symbol. I never liked that because symbols don't talk. People talk. So I wanted to put faces there so that I could really, and also faces have expressions. The whole thing about comics is that you're expressing on so many different levels at the same time. I like to try and utilize as much of that as I can. So if I've got a character, their face on there, you better believe I'm trying to indicate something through their facial expression and give that line a little bit of a twist or a lift with that. So yeah, I love doing the narration box with the head inside of it. And again, that is one place, that's the only place you'll see quotation marks in an Evil Inc. comic, unless it's like the title of a piece of art or something like that. But you'll never see quotation marks except for that, because I want to make sure that you understand that that's not a narration, that's a continuation or the beginning of somebody talking. Now, here's what I don't like. And again, this comes back from a manga. You'll see people do that with word balloons. For an off-panel speaker, they'll use a word balloon with no tail, but the head inside the word balloon,
or
the
floating
same
across
way that we
line,
just described for a narration box. I'm a big fan of that for narration boxes. I hate it personally for my aesthetic. I hate it for word balloons. I won't do that.
Well, yeah, I dislike both for my own aesthetic, but here's my thing. And one of the reasons why I don't like the narration box being used is that for me, the iconography of a narration box, that square for me, for my aesthetic, is something very specific, which is narration. It is not a character voice. And so anytime I see a character voice in a narration box, to me, it's like the iconography of comics is a thin veneer over what you're actually seeing. And if you start to cheat it around the edges, I get nervous about you're losing some readers, you're confusing some readers. And so for me, the narration box is just for the narrator. You had made the point of the omniscient narrator. And what's interesting is for Drive, I don't have an omniscient narrator. I have an untrustworthy narrator. And some people haven't figured that out yet, that the narrator in Drive doesn't know everything and knows some things wrong. And so that's always fun. But if you confuse people with, again, for me, if you confuse people with dialogue or even monologues in what is otherwise a narration box, I think that is confusing the thin veneer of iconography that we overlay on comics. And again, I think personally, both Brad and I, our default position is, God, if you can avoid it, try to avoid off-panel
an off-panel
voices.
Speaker? Yeah.
Because you're seeing that we've gone, I don't know how long, 10 minutes on this already, about the potential of things to go wrong. I've seen it done wrong way more than I've seen it done right, you know?
Yeah, and I will say this. I want to go back to the narrator because I think that's where we find our basic difference. I don't have a narrator. The only time you'll see a narration box is for things like later.
Oh, good point. Well, see, this goes back to the point that I was making on a philosophical level. Your narrator is your core characters. When you think about it.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's why for you, it's okay that they're in the narration box, because ultimately we're
Exactly.
seeing the story through their viewpoint, right?
And so many times, especially speaking of, like when I'm inking, I think before the show, I was telling you, I like to watch things that I've seen 100 times while I'm inking because I'm not really paying attention to it, but it's comforting.
Right.
Arrested Development is one of those. And every time I'm in an Arrested Development jag, I really wish that I had established a narrator, because you can do so much comedy with the narrator says one thing and the scene is another. Right? We've seen that, so many times where,
yes,
the narration, somebody says, well, I'm going to study hard for this text or for this test.
And the irony is immediate. Yeah.
And the narrator said, plot twist, he doesn't study, or whatever. I'll tell you what's going to happen. So, ironically, Greystone Inn, the narrator was an actual sentient character that lived inside of a box and was just words, but interacted with the characters. I had a very hat on top of a hat narrator for Greystone Inn.
Yeah.
In a place where I probably could have used it more. I never established a narrator. I always wished I kind of did. I every time I start a new storyline, I think, oh, maybe this is where I introduce a narrator. And then it's so unnatural at this point that I don't. And in this point, having had this conversation with you, I don't think I ever will, because you're absolutely right. It's just going to muddy those waters. Because again, since I have no narrator, I don't have to worry about a whole lot of confusion when I'm putting those narration boxes up with the heads in them, because it's already established that that's what happens when a character speaks.
Right. I think, too, that we should acknowledge, for all the things that comics do right, one of the things that comics doesn't, unless someone's really good and has slowly established it in the mood of their strip, the things that comics doesn't do great is off-panel voices.
Yeah.
Unless you really establish some sort of shtick that works in your comic, there's not a lot that I can think of that do it well, or that it couldn't have been done a better way. So, like, in the same way that film and TV can incorporate music in a way that comics can't, right? I think we just need to acknowledge that it's not the best to have. Like, I think there are things that comics can do better than film and TV, and this is not one of them, right? And so I think that's where I would come down on it.
And I'm just going to give you one more thought as we're wrapping this topic up, and that is, if you're in a situation where you've got somebody that you feel has to be off camera or off panel, remember that's another technique that you can do, is to put to introduce the character in that panel, but to put that character in silhouette. So we can see the characters there, but we don't know who the character is. Or I've done this a few times. I'll just put like the hand, like maybe it's a pointing, so they're pointing, you there, stop. And all you see is the silhouette of the hand in an extreme close-up, as the people he's talking to is in perhaps a far background. Right. Remember, you've got things like silhouettes and extreme close-ups of
forced perspective.
Yes, you've got lots of tools at your disposal. Dave and I are kind of on the same mind of this. I don't do a person speaking off camera unless I absolutely have to. And then, like I said at the very top of this topic, I have a lot of rules for myself that I follow.
And also, before we sound too judgy, again, both Brad and I have done it. We've used it before in situations. It's going to come up. We have used it. We will use them again. And there are, so it's not like it's a never use. It's just like, if you can get away with not doing it that way, don't. So anyway, Brad, I got a quick question for you that I think can be a quick 5-minute answer from you. And this comes in from Kay. Kay writes, you've talked extensively about how to price your physical goods, but what about digital goods? I'm finding it difficult to choose a price when I have no production value to account for. Production value is a good point. So Brad, how do you price? How do we suggest someone go about pricing digital goods but of course are a non-physical item? They are intangibles. How do you price that?
This is such a great question, because as we've talked about on previous shows, the first step of knowing what your price is knowing what your costs are. You can't know your price until your cost. So many of us got into trouble in the past where we said, well, Marvel does a graphic novel and they price it at $10. So my graphic novel is going to be $10. I've got to compete with them, right? The problem is Marvel has one set of costs and you got another set of costs. And I actually had this problem. My very first book, I got it into Diamond Distribution. And by the time they take the books for $65 25% off of the cover price. Long story short, for what they were paying me for the books, it was less than it was going to cost me to give them the books. I was already in the black. I was, or in the red. What's the bad one? I was in the doghouse is what I was.
The red.
I was bad. So yeah, you got to know your costs before you can know your price. Kay brings up a great point. What's the cost of a PDF? It's nothing. It's negligible. It's the time you compiled the PDF. It's not much. So here's what I'm going to tell you along with everything else. And this even goes once you cover your costs. This is true for that too. Prices are, especially for digital goods, prices are imaginary. Prices, and that doesn't mean that you should make them imaginarily low, but prices are value, and value is an imaginary concept. Okay, now here's what I mean by that. It has the value that you give it.
Right.
And if you give it in other words, if you've got a PDF, you're going to immediately say, well, it didn't cost me anything, so I'm going to make it a quarter. Because then lots and lots and lots of people are going to buy it, and I'll have lots and lots of quarters, and that's all going to add up. That's basically the heart of crowdfunding. Lots of small payments add up to a big payment. The problem with that is that you're giving a very, very small value to that as well. And when you say I've got a PDF and it's only a quarter, somebody's going to say immediately when they see that, they're going to say, well, there's a reason it's only a quarter. It's virtually worthless. The person couldn't get more money for it if they tried.
Right.
So what you have to do is remember that prices are value, value is imaginary. And the third part of the triumvirate of setting a price is that prices can always come down, but they can never go up.
Right.
If you put that PDF out for 25 cents and the next week say, good news, it's $1 now. You've got an uphill climb.
Good news,
selling.
everyone.
Yes. Now or like somebody says, how much would you be willing to pay for this? And the reader says 25 cents, and you go, how about $1? You can't. The negotiations don't go in that direction.
Right.
So I always, when I'm setting a price for things, especially digital things, I always go, but also with print things, I always go a little bit higher because I know I can always bring that price down. Right. In other words, if I'm selling a book, a print book for $30, it'll go into distribution for $30. That'll be fine. Nothing says I can't sell that book on my site for $25.
Right.
Nothing, and still make, as long as I'm making an adequate profit in there. Nothing says I can't sell it for $15. Nothing says I can't sell it just for 1 week only for $10, as long as I continue to make profit. So your price is something that should be high enough to give it the perception of value, and still make it obviously worth your time. And something that just in case it's too high, you can always bring it down. A lot of the digital stuff I started out selling, I started out at a certain price point, like a $2 price point. Mm-hmm. And for the stuff that I was selling at that point, I could see there wasn't a lot of interest. So what happens? You don't go to your readers and say, oh, I noticed there wasn't a lot of interest at $2. Let's try it at $1. That's not how you market. You say, again, good news, everyone. I'm running a sale. No longer $2. It's now slashed in half to $1. Right. And then you've got some people that are willing to take a try because, again, that perceived value is now high, but you've given them also the perception of a bargain. And people love bargains. People love to save money. The whole idea was to get them buying those e-books and e-comics so that when the next one came around, they were already used to it. Maybe if I had done my job well, giving them the PDF, they would want the next one. So long and short of it is the price of a digital good is imaginary. Set it a little bit higher than you think it should be, knowing and realizing that you can and probably in some cases will come down a little bit. And don't make the mistake of underpricing it, because then at the same time, you're undervaluing it.
Right. So just to reiterate a couple things here, it is an imaginary number.
Yeah.
You have to take into account your costs, much of which will be covered by, or underwritten rather, by the fact that you're producing a physical book. So this is just an ebook version, for example, of the physical thing, right? Another one is the value. What does it offer someone? Like, for example, I can read Evil Link for free on the paid website there that Brad offers. But for me, the value is it's a contained unit. I can put it on my iPad. I can read it at the beach or whatever it is without Wi-Fi, right? So that's the value of it. The second one is the perceived value, which is different than value. It's one of the reasons why packages are made wider than an object for a shelf on a store. It's because it's a perceived value that is seemed, right? And then the last item is scarcity. Whether it's by time or by price or exclusivity, scarcity is a big one. So, for example, some digital items you might say, "Hey, special offer for Patreon. This digital item can only be gotten if you do it on Patreon."
Yes.
You are creating scarcity. Or you could say, "Hey, it's on sale right now until Tuesday." You are creating scarcity based on time, right?
Right.
And so I think Brad summarized it really well. And to Brad's point, you can always come down. You can never go up. So test it out at whatever price you would be. I tend to think that at best, you could probably get 2/3 of the cost of the physical item. At worst, probably 1/3 of what the physical item goes for. And I think somewhere in that ballpark is probably where you should be pricing most things. But again, start high, test it out, test the waters, try a sale. If the sale goes well, maybe leave the sale price up, that kind of thing. So again, the key learning thing from Brad there is that in addition to all the ways he explained it wonderfully, is start higher than you think so that you can come down rather than making the mistake of starting lower and never being able to go up. And I think that's a great way to end that, Brad.
And speaking of things going down, I'm going to have to bring you down by telling you that you've been listening to ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my friend Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the cartoonist and creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my friend Dave Kellett, co-director of Stripped and cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com. And don't forget, today's the last day, newsheldonbook.com. Join us.
Thank you, my friends, by the way, for joining. I really genuinely do appreciate that. The kindness is very much appreciated by me as a cartoonist anytime someone jumps in on a Kickstarter, so thank you. And I will say the ComicLab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net, and this episode was edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love ComicLab, you can rate and review the show, and your kind words may be featured... I started stuttering, I'm sorry. May be featured on a future episode like this one that came in to us from Twitter. Monica writes, listening to the ComicLab podcast while I work today is making me feel a lot less isolated in my work and missing comic pals at shows. Thanks, Comics Uncles.
Oh, Comics Uncles?
Comics Uncles, yeah, we're going to have to trademark that.
Boy, we've gotten Comics Dads, Comics Uncles. It's that's kind of
never
sweet
comics
about that.
Heartthrobs. We don't get that one.
We don't get because you know what? I think because our photos are available online, so we don't get that. We don't get comics heartthrobs.
We're fooling nobody.
People, I love the idea that people are like googling. Oh, I like that voice. That's a pleasant voice. Let me Google their photo. No, that's a Comics Uncle. Yeah, that's not a comics heartthrob.
Yeah, second twice removed.
I will say ComicLab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/ComicLab. So I'll go ahead and say that twice. Patreon.com/ComicLab.
Oh, and listen, Kayvon Novak, if you're listening, this is Brad talking. Just between you and me, just reach out to Dave. It'd mean the world to him. He just a little hello, a little thoughtful hi there. I think he'd love that.
Listen, I know you're joking, but I'm not fighting this, Brad. Kayvon, Dave at davekellett.com. Drop me an email. I'm here, my friend.
You know what? Honest to God, what would be the coolest thing is he says something, we'll bring him right on the show.
Oh my God, in a hot second.
Oh,
you know, my wife and I know Harvey, who plays Guillermo on the show.
Oh, really?
And Harvey says that Kayvon is the nicest guy in the world, which just cinches the deal for me.
Oh,
that
yeah.
Kayvon is super nice.
Yeah, and maybe if he's read a comic, we'll talk about that comic he read. we'll just make up an excuse to bring him on the show, you know?
He's just like, hey, he's like coming for Brittany. He's like, yeah, I think I read an Andy Cap 20 years ago. We're like, that's good enough. You're on the show.
We'll do a show. We can.
We'll build an hour around that.